I am going to hand it over to Lisa Delaney and Dr. Heidi Cram from the Family Matters Research Group.
Thank you, Emily. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this nation home. Please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and to consider how we are and can each, in our own way, try to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. We understand that some of the content expressed today may bring up a range of emotions. We encourage you to care for your safety and well-being. If you need to reach out for support, please contact a mental health care provider in your community or an organization like Crisis Services Canada. Thank you, Emily and CIPSERC, for your support in making this interactive series a reality. On behalf of the Family Matters Research Group, I, along with my co-host, Dr. Heidi Cram, would like to welcome you to today's session. When we did our initial launch of PSP Families Network at the end of January, we asked what other topics you'd like to learn more about. You asked, we answered. Couples and trauma was strongly endorsed, so we are thrilled to be able to introduce to you our speakers, top couples trauma therapists in the field, Dr. Tim Black and Dr. Rahel Dekel. Dr. Tim Black is a registered psychologist, associate professor of counseling psychology at the University of Victoria, and national clinical co-advisor at Wounded Warriors Canada. Tim will discuss trauma, what it is and why we need to deal with it. And Dr. Rahel Dekel, full professor in the Louis and Gabby Weisfield School of Social Work at Bar-Ilan University in Israel, will discuss how trauma can present itself in couples. Tim and Rahel will speak for approximately 25 minutes, followed by a moderated question and answer session where you can anonymously submit questions to them. As Emily previously mentioned, tomorrow you will receive a post-event survey to the email address you used to register for the event. It also includes a link to join our email list to be notified of our future events, news and research, as well as opportunities to participate in research with us. Now, without further ado, I turn it over to you, Tim.
Great, thanks. Good morning, everybody. Nice to meet you all. Just a bit of nice to meet you all. I can see all of your faces and your names and your blank screens there. So nice to meet your blank screens and your names, or your images and your names. I'm here on Lekwungen and Sinchatan speaking people's territory on Vancouver Island. And my sort of a little bit of my background coming into this is mostly I'm a group counseling specialist. And so my connection to couples and trauma is through Wounded Warriors Canada's COPE program. And so actually having couples in groups is more my area that I've worked on and then dealing with specializing in post-traumatic stress disorder. So my comments this morning are try to give a very brief overview and clarify some terms around trauma, because I think a lot of people, they hear the word trauma, they intuitively have a sense that it's not good, but maybe aren't as clear. So the slide that you see in front of us is a way that we, in our programs, whether with the COPE couples or with other programs that we run through Wounded Warriors Canada, how people get traumatized. So it's very brief. And again, we're mostly wanting to have a conversation here. So trying to get a few things clarified. The first thing is we kind of think about the trauma formula as a way of understanding how does someone get from being exposed to what we call a traumatic event to actually being traumatized, because trauma can mean many things to different people. So think about this slide as saying, how does someone go from not being traumatized to being traumatized? There's certain dominoes that need to fall in order for this sort of the likelihood for this to happen. So as we work through the slide here, you'll see the first domino that has to fall is exposure to a traumatic event. And so we use the definition from the DSM. Some of you may be familiar with the DSM of a traumatic event, which, so not everybody necessarily agrees with this, and that's fine too. Like just saying for our purposes, there's a very specific reason why we do this, and that is exposure to actual or threatened death, exposure to actual or threatened serious violence or injury, and actual or threatened exposure to sexual violence. So again, actual or threatened. So this is really important to understand that you may be exposed to death or you may be threatened with death. Those two things are part of what the event is. So that would be considered a traumatic event. Actual or threatened violence and serious injury. So that would also be considered. So even if someone threatens you with violence, that's a potential, that is considered a traumatic event exposure, but we'll talk about why it doesn't necessarily mean you're traumatized. And then actual or threatened sexual violence. So someone threatening sexual violence or actually, of course, experiencing sexual violence. That's the first thing. So in our first domino that falls, in order to even consider being traumatized from my perspective in my field, if you've been exposed to one of those events, then that's the first thing that has to happen for you to be considered ever traumatized. If you've never been exposed to an event like that, from my perspective, it's not possible to be traumatized, but this can be across the lifespan. And the next part of the definition, the first part, is resulting in a significant limbic response. And we don't really have time to go so deeply into this, but basically your limbic system, and this is very, very oversimplified, is sort of responsible for mobilizing you when you're threatened with life or death kinds of things. At a low level, it's like, you know, if you're nervous with public speaking, your palms start sweating and your heart starts pounding. It's the same system, but at a very like minimal level, right up to when somebody might attack somebody and the limbic system takes over. And you've probably heard the limbic system language of like fight, flight, freeze, or flop or fawn. So the limbic system will make you fight, it'll make you run, it'll make you freeze, or it'll make you fall and collapse to your knees. And basically the whole point of that limbic system is to try to keep you alive. So that first thing in the trauma formula, and I think the relevance for this for families is that if one of your partners or if your partner is actually in a field where this is what they do for their living, which is a lot of what we talked about, they're going to be continually on a daily, 4 days on, 4 days off, whatever, they're going to be continually exposed to traumatic events, but they may or may not have significant limbic responses. Sometimes they'll be exposed to it and nothing happens, then traumatization is unlikely. But if that significant limbic response happens, that fight, flight, freeze, or flop happens, that's the first piece. The next piece then is that when that happens, your body has to kind of come down and digest that. So the second piece to the trauma formula, the second domino that falls, is if you don't get a chance to complete that. We've used the term sort of digesting. It's sort of like if something interrupts your digestion. They always say like you don't go swimming after you eat like a large pizza, because swimming interrupts your digestive process because the blood to use your muscles is taken away from your intestines or whatever, and you get cramped up. So the second thing with the trauma event is that you have this significant limbic response, and there's a natural coming down that has to happen in order for you just to process that stuff. Like you think about almost getting in a car wreck and your hands start shaking. And you see that's the adrenaline starting to sort of go through your body. If you don't complete that limbic response sort of completion, if you don't digest that fully, that's the second domino that we consider falling. Again, for those of you who have people in your lives where they are being exposed to this kind of stuff, think of it as they go to a terrible accident on the highway where a child is killed, and then they have a reaction, and before they can deal with it, the radio goes, and now they've got to go to a domestic assault call where they go and something terrible happens there. And then just when they're finished dealing with that one, they get a call that there was a fire downtown and they have to go down to that one. And that's a 12-hour shift. So they can have just a matter of just multiple trauma exposures, multiple limbic responses, and then never really getting a chance to come down. And then they start the next 12-hour shift the next day. And then they do 12 hours shifts 4 days in a row. And then, they're exhausted at the end of those 4 days. So when we talk about it taking 30 days, sometimes when the limbic response is so intense, it may actually take 30 days for you to stop thinking about it, for you to stop having nightmares about it, or for your body to fully come down. Again, because when that system comes online, it comes online instantly, but it takes some time to come back down. So if it comes back down and you fully process that, you probably won't end up traumatized. You'll suffer a little bit, but in 30 days. So typically you can't get diagnosed with being traumatized inside of 30 days because we're not sure. Is it just taking a long time to come down, or is this going to be something that lasts for a long time? But if you do that, if you thwart that, if you stop that process, that's the second domino. And then the third one that really seems to seal the deal, the third domino, is that if someone has had an exposure, they've had this limbic response, they haven't finished it, and then they get exposure to negative social responses. That seems to be the third domino that now you're almost guaranteed. And I try to be careful as a researcher with this. I mean, we've not done experiments to prove this. So I can't say, that's why I have the little brackets at the bottom, likelihood substantially increased, just being honest, that I can't say for 100% that if all these things happen, you'll be traumatized. But negative social responses can come from inside your own head, like beating yourself up. Oh, I should have done better. I shouldn't be feeling this way. I'm crazy for feeling this way. Or it can come from even well-meaning people giving you negative responses. For those of you, again, with spouses who have and work in these environments, what I see oftentimes is to see organizations either response or lack of response that really lands hard. The text that you get from your supervisor, or the fact that something bad happened and nobody even called you. You went home at the end of your shift and no one even said anything. So the trauma formula for me is a sort of an oversimplified way of helping people understand, how do I go from being someone who's not traumatized to someone who has nightmares and flashbacks and night sweats, and I'm aggravated and I have no patience with the kids and I don't remember stuff. So that's what I wanted to at least get into, at least put out there as part of my conversation, to get us thinking about this stuff, that having a limbic response is perfectly natural. It's what our brains do when we're threatened. Coming down from that is also perfectly natural, but it feels bad. If it's really intense, it'll feel bad. Like I said, sometimes people even will vomit. Sometimes people have very visceral reactions. That's also normal, but we get scared of it, so we stop it. We suck it up and go, oh, I can't do that, and we go on with our day. And then usually, even well-meaning people don't really know how to respond when someone's going through that, and so people don't know what to do. They say nothing, or they try to say something and it lands not well. So why does this matter in terms of families? Well, your people are out there being exposed to traumatic events. That doesn't mean they're going to be inevitably traumatized. They're likely going to have limbic responses that they're going to have to come down from. Most organizations don't train their people how to do that and to take it as sort of a regular thing. Like I always think with athletes who have to cool down afterwards, I think trauma exposed professionals also need the skills and they're not taught that. And then of course, with the organization being, a bureaucracy most of the times, negative social responses become the thing that really end up triggering people. So this is in the context of having someone who works in these environments, but of course we know we're all born and we carry on in life. So these things can happen in childhood, all sorts of different times of our life. And you know that you're traumatized because when bad things happen, if they end, you think about it and it doesn't really bother you anymore. Someone who's traumatized is reliving it. I think the last thing I would say before turning over to my friend and colleague Rachel is, trauma isn't remembering bad stuff and feeling bad about it. Trauma really is actually reliving it. And the reason why you're reliving it is it gets, we usually, I can't remember who did this, but they say, this is your brain, this is your limbic system inside the gray squiggly part, and your fingers are the gray squiggly part. So most memory gets processed in the gray squiggly part, but metaphorically, trauma gets stuck here, and here there's no time. It's always in the present and it's always in the body. So trauma is moving it from this part of the brain to this part of the brain. And if it gets stuck here, people don't really remember it as much as they relive it. And that's why it's so different than just remembering really bad stuff that happened, because the body responds the same way as though it's happening. So I'm not sure, Lisa, how we're doing on timing wise, but I'm happy to pause and pass it over to Rachel at this time and continue the conversation.
Thanks, Tim. You're actually right on time. That's just 10 minutes and so much information. I do think that, when we think about these trauma coming up, when we think about PSP jobs being trauma exposed, I think, you're making that point where, we really do have, it's the nature of the job. So being able to plan for how to deal with those exposures, I think it's important, as you say, that trauma exposures do not automatically mean that someone will be traumatized. So being able to recognize and process a traumatic response is important so that they don't get stuck, as you mentioned. Now, I think the other thing that is really interesting and speaks now to the segue to Rahel is that spouses and significant others are not trauma therapists. And it's important to not expect them to take on that role. So thank you very much, Tim. We'll be back for questions, but Rahel, thanks.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Well, okay, so maybe we don't need a presentation now, I don't know, because I don't have a slide. For me, thank you for inviting me. I'm here in Israel, so for us it's like 6 p.m. So I'm crossing fingers that my kids are not going kind of make some noise. I hope it works. So I'm a social worker, work in Israel for a long time in research and in clinic intervention in relations to individuals, and mainly in the last few years in couples coping with trauma, with different traumatic events, mainly military, terror, medical events, road accidents. And I would talk a little bit about what's going on when you live with someone that suffers from the symptoms that Dr. Tim Black just introduced. So thank you to the Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment for inviting me. Thank you, Lisa and Heidi and the Families Matter Research Group for your commitment and supporting families of public safety personnel. And thank you, Dr. Tim Black, whom I met a few years ago in Vancouver, for introducing so clearly what and how continuous exposure to stress and threat event might result in distress at the individual level. However, and luckily, many times this person does not live alone. He or she has their partner, spouses, brothers, and might have kids. So the question, what's going on with the significant others? When he or she feels anxious, numbed, or detached, it affects and has ripples effects on close one. This is true for each of us. So if I come back from work with a bad mood, sorry. Sorry about that. So if I come back home from work with a bad mood or a good one, it affects my kids. The way every one of us feel and behave in a normal, in routine times, have effects on others. Moreover, the other person reacts to my behavior and to what they think and understand that I've been doing or going through. So if I behave in a certain way, shout loudly, walk home and just enter to my room, this affects my family. They are trying to understand what was going on. Can they prepare me tea and help me to calm down? Or maybe they are focused on their needs and might be disappointed because they were waiting for me to share something. And I just came home late and nervous. So they are actually continuing circles of direct and mainly indirect, not clear communication between parents and their children and between spouses, reciprocal effects between partners, emotions, behaviors, and cognition. Everyone is doing something, the other is trying to understand what's going on, reacting, and then the first one react again. The question is what happens when one of the partners suffers from distress symptom, when one tries to avoid communication and has might have challenges in controlling anger as was described. So when we have one partner, and this is like I'm moving to the second point, who suffer from distress symptoms, is traumatization or as traumatization causes a ripple effect. The symptoms that were described earlier, or I described, anxious, numbing, hyperarousal, detachment, anger, are associated with changes in the ability to relate to others and the ability of others to relate to the traumatized persons. Many symptoms and behaviors are not necessarily clear. Moreover, sometimes one does not know what to be expected. So what we see in the literature and in the clinical work is that partners of loved ones that copes with such symptoms have described their behavior, their own behavior, as walking on eggshells. Does this term sound familiar? Partners of females that are exposed to trauma or stressful experiences say that they work hard, that their partner would not get angry. They work hard not to create conflict in the afternoon. Partners are trying to hold back from expressing their thoughts or feeling out of concern for upsetting their PSP family member. They might even change routine, modify leisure activities, or take on over additional tasks and chores. They may also avoid things, places, or people that cause their partner distress symptom. As such, a vicious negative cycle might occur. So the changing and adapting the behavior in order to keep everything on a lower level of conflict might help to alleviate the distress in the short term. So the spouse might take the kids out. So this time, this specific afternoon, there was not fight. They might not say something, they saw something, they want to say, oh, why do you go to your room? And they might say, no, 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 I keep quiet, I take a deep breath, and there might be quiet again this time. However, this might promote long-term avoidance and higher distress. Such behavior and emotion changing and controlling from the size of the spout might contribute to the maintenance and even to exacerbation of the symptoms. We are asking ourselves why, because what is happening, one is trying to do instead of the main partner who is suffering from distress, is taking more and more control. The other person feels that he has less and less control and less involvement. And they are looking at him like maybe as a child, maybe someone that they are a little bit anxious from his reaction. So this suggests that while partners, spouses, kids act with the intention to alleviate their own and their loved one with the distress symptoms to improve the relation, this is not necessarily the outcome. So they are motivated by good intention, but minimizing their loved one's exposure to situation or even to places that he or she finds in nervous. They don't want to meet friends. They're so tired. They say, no, 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 I don't want to meet. I don't want to go out. So everyone is staying at home and could promote avoidance and distance between partners. So what can be done to improve this accommodation, to make things clearer, to set a change, a preliminary set of change in this situation? I suggest for this evening, and I do have kind of many more ideas and knowledge, but one thing that we should know and can take home is working on communication. I want to say that communication problems and misunderstanding are the most often reported problem among any couples. And improving communication, we know, is associated strongly with relation satisfaction. So communication is a very important factor in the long way to improve satisfaction and relation. So if couples are not able to express their ideas and they go separately and they just try to keep it on a lower levels of kind of flashback, waterize, they exclude from each other important experiences and feeling. They left feeling disconnected from each other and their intimacy suffer. A person with the constant stress, the one with the symptoms, might be afraid of sharing his idea, doesn't want to talk about traumatic experiences. The other person might say, oh, I'm not sure I want to hear, and I see it might hurt his feeling, so it's better not to talk. However, these ripples of avoidance are becoming wider and wider. And trauma-related symptoms even interfere with communication. So if you suffer from irritability, short span of attention, anger, this all makes communication more challenging. The first step in effective communication is to get familiar with communication channels. Every conversation has a different goal, and there are two main channels of communication. One is that I just want to share my feelings, my emotion. The other channel is problem solving. So we have to ask ourselves, what channel I'm using now? What is the aim of the conversation I'm doing now or aiming to do? And I just want to share that I'm upset or sad, or I just need to solve a concrete problem. We know that people on the job are really, really more trained in solving problems than sharing their emotion. So I, as a spouse, might just want to say I had a bad day. I didn't want to make the other person feel guilty or tell him, now you should do everything. Sometimes I would say, you have to take now the kids to the shower or to have a bath. But sometimes they feel that this is not the challenge I am in. Are me and my spouse, my partner, are on the same channel? If not, you might need to change your channel to have a better communication. Many conflicts, and this is my tip on communication, are created as a result in different expectations of each of the partners from the same concrete conversation. Sometimes I find myself talking with my face at the refrigerator, asking for help. Nobody's hearing me. And I just feeling, oh, nobody is coming to help me. But I was asking for help, but it was not clear, concrete, on a concrete way. So I just maybe want to share that my day was work, but I don't want to get advice about how to find a new job. Or the opposite example, when we have to decide as a couple what we would do with the kids this afternoon or in the weekend, and the other partner just going to complaining and sharing how the kids are a continuous challenge and he is fed up and the problem is not solved. So the idea is first to be aware that we have these two channels, and then to be aware what channel I am or you are, and to try and ask or identify the channel of the partner. Is this the right moment to share about something at work, to give advice, or just listen or respond his will for some quiet? So this is in a nutshell 3 points that I wanted to share with you. There are a reciprocal relation in families in general and among couples in particular, stress symptom among one partner has ripple effects, and the desire to help and to keep everything quiet and to do instead of this partner is not necessarily beneficial for the long run. And communication and talking to each other is important, and there are ways to learn how to do it. Thank you, and I hope I contributed even for a little degree to your understanding.
Thank you, Rahel. You know, I think that the building from the individual that Tim talks about to this way that it ripples into this kind of reciprocal effect, being able to constantly anticipate. So this idea of walking on eggshells, I think, is probably the thing that every family study on PTSD uses that expression. It's just so common, and people feel like they're holding their breath and this constant kind of anticipation and accommodation. One of the other things that, you know, we've talked about, you know, when we've got this takeaway messages, these emotional responses, I mean, they don't necessarily look like traumatic, like a response to a traumatic exposure necessarily, right? So when you're in a relationship and someone's avoiding or withdrawal, you know, engaging in withdrawal or criticism, or is volatile, or, you know, seems to have a need for control, the spouse might not attach that to some sort of traumatic event at work, or some traumatic processing that might be going on. Being able to figure out, you know, that shared channel is a great message, and thinking about when is the right time to talk about these potential traumatic exposures. If your partner is very reactive, this is not the moment. And so certainly, you know, today we've got 1 hour to kind of introduce the topic. But learning to recognize when trauma is impacting a spouse takes time and lots of reflection as you learn to read one another. And if you feel that things are overwhelming, ask for help for you to support you and your well-being and mental health. So thank you. And now I'm going to turn attention back to Tim on some questions that we've compiled. So Tim, if we can progress can we move the slide forward, Emily, please? Tim. Okay. So Tim, you know, we've kind of touched on some of these behaviors, but, you know, how do you tell behaviorally when someone is feeling traumatized? Like, do you have any thoughts that people can take away to reflect on?
Yeah, there's a really nice metaphor that we use in the trauma field called the window tolerance, which Pat Ogden talks about, and other authors, Dan Siegel. It's counterintuitive sometimes, but it really depends what you're looking at. Sometimes you'll see the classic thing of people just being completely overwhelmed, where they just get so overwhelmed they can't even speak, and they're just so emotional they just barely even to speak, and it's usually in response to something that they're remembering or that kind of stuff. So that's one way of thinking about it. What we tend to see a lot more of is sort of, that's like what Rahel talked about, being hyper aroused, that very, very overwhelmed kind of person. That's probably easier to see. The other side of it is when people are exposed to trauma a lot, they tend to go what's called hypo aroused, meaning they disconnect from their feelings. And so they might actually just be completely monotone, and they may be able to tell you really, really intense details, but there's not any emotion to it. They can tell a story, but almost like they're talking almost like a robotic kind of voices. It's part of that kind of thing. Really, in terms of looking at people, even as a trauma therapist, there's no actual way to look at somebody and know if they're traumatized. You have to talk to them, and really you have to ask them, hey, what's going on for you? And really the idea is, like, traumatized for me is a traumatic event that you're still reliving, or traumatic events. Some people have multiple traumatic events over a lifetime that they're still kind of dealing with and living. So there's no foolproof way to just look at a spouse and go, oh, you're traumatized. But so that's why we try to say, like, if you know somebody who's being exposed to trauma continually, and they used to be somebody who could laugh and they could joke, they would have a good time, they could be relaxed, because trauma is usually antithetical to humor. People who are traumatized don't laugh very much, and they don't they don't really enjoy things very much. So if that person used to be that way and you start to see that's going away and they're getting more angry, or they're getting more sort of quiet, or they just don't feel anything, or they say like, I just don't feel it, I just not up for it. Those are little signs that I kind of go, I wonder what's going on there. But it's very hard, even as I think Rachel would probably say the same thing. Like if you know someone's traumatized, there's certain things you can see, but there's different ways of presenting. So what I guess my message to the folks here is like, you're not going to know unless you ask the person. And what I would say is that typically asking the person what's going on for them is more helpful than ever asking them what they went through. Because as soon as you start asking people what they went through, that's when things can start to get triggered. And it's rarely helpful to actually ask people what they went through at work. What did you see? What did you do? I typically, we would never encourage anybody to ask that anyways. So I know it's a bit of a complicated answer, but we don't want to set people up to think that, oh, if you just see this, it means your partner's traumatized, because it's really not that simple.
Well, and Tim, in our conversations kind of leading up to this, you talked about, this window of tolerance, and how as a trauma therapist for the past 20 years, you can still trigger people, and how, when you have a spouse who might be wondering, like, what's going on here? And is my spouse having a traumatic response? When is a good or bad time? Do you have any tips around that?
Yeah, I think that when you start to see, like, especially if the person has started to get into that reactive kind of thing, and you've seen it, they've been in the business long enough, and they're starting to change, and they're just much more volatile. This is why I'm so passionate about organizations teaching their members what's going on, because a lot of times people just don't even know what's happening. They just think it's, oh, I'm just aggravated from work. Little things. Again, I share this from a couple on one of our COPE programs, who they came up with, and we always say it's both people are responsible. So both people have responsibility. So the member has to know when they're feeling this way and not engage. And the spouse has to know when they're feeling this way, don't engage. So like a clever little trick that this one couple came up with, they got a little Incredible Hulk figurine. And when the member was having a bad day, they just put it in the middle of the living room table. So they didn't have to talk about it, and the spouse, but the responsibility was they had to come back and take it after they'd come back down and were ready to talk. So it wasn't like, I get to put the Hulk there and you don't get to talk to me for a week. It's like, this is just a temporary thing. This is a bad day. Oh, I walk in, it's a bad day. But you're responsible to take the Incredible Hulk doll down and go talk to the person and say, I'm in a better place now, I can talk. To me, timing is everything. But I think for me, it's not about guessing or guessing right, guessing wrong. Both people have a responsibility to bring the awareness into the relationship to know. And if your spouse really isn't in that spot where they can talk about it, we don't talk about it. It's like, when will be a good time? Because then you avoid that thing of, well, I never want to talk about it. The avoidance that Rahel was talking about. Well, I just won't ever be ready because I'm traumatized. To me, that's not good enough. It has to be both people. This we say, both people have to tackle PTSD. It can't be the spouse to do it, and it can't all be the member to do it. You have to tackle it together when it's in the home.
Yeah, I think that it really highlights the importance of upstream prevention, so that people have the language. We did have a question come in before we turn to Rahel for some other questions. One of the participants is wondering if you could explain the negative social responses a little bit more. So, can you give some examples of what that might look like?
Yeah. So like an example might be someone comes home and has a bad day, and they've had a very bad sort of triggering day. And the supervisor said something to them that made them angry. And probably a negative social response, talking about with Rahel, would be, well, why don't you just go complain to the union? Just go talk to the union. They're not allowed to do that, and you need to go talk to the union. You can't take that. That, even though well-intentioned, may actually set the person off, because it may not actually be anything to do with the union or whatever. So and just not talking about it, just not responding. It's really hard to say. So we usually say, don't worry about not doing things. I always just say, I ask people, just add this to your repertoire, is like, how was that for you? Just add that to your list of questions. So how was that for you? And then be quiet. Don't say anything. Don't just, how was that for you? Well, it was bad. Okay. Again, without going into problem solving. So Rachel may have other ideas as well. I just want to say too, I did get a question message to me individually that I don't think went to the group, which I'm happy to address, but I also want to make sure, so I got a question that I'd be happy to address as well, but I know the person also messaged me, so I'm not sure if they want it publicly addressed or if they want me to just type something back, but I can't do that right now. So anyways, just saying, I got your message, I can see it there, I just don't know how we want to deal with that.
And maybe they can clarify that with Emily,
Okay.
and then we'll know how to deal with that.
Okay.
So, it's interesting because this, when you're living in a family that is shaped by public safety personnel jobs, the risks and requirements, there's a lot of in and out and change and non-standard work. And there's a lot of additional kind of logistical challenges that come along with these families. So Rahila, I'm wondering, recognizing that there are some additional strains on these families, how can couples go about developing a plan for how and when to talk about the trauma? Because over the life course, those kinds of opportunities to have those conversations might be different if they're doing like, here's the kid, you take the kid kind of at the door as people are transitioning to and from work, that adds something else. So Rahel, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how couples, what you've seen successful.
Thank you, Heidi. I just want to add one thing to like team answers, because he was saying like social support is to say someone you should go to the union, but sometimes it's even worse. Someone as a spouse would say maybe the spouse, he or she were tired and they are fed up already. They might even say sometimes, maybe only in Israel, but I'm not sure, maybe it's your fault. I mean, the negative response would be even harder. I want to put it on the table. It might be like, okay, I fed up with your complaining. I mean, it's the second time you've changed, you changed your role already. So the level of low response and low social support might be going down and down during this circle of interaction. So this is, and we know the social support and spouse support is that important. That's the reason, part of the reason we are trying to think here, how to support both spouses separately and as a couple. Going to your question, Heidi, I think that the answer is in the question. Like saying, having a plan, because usually we do have our own life and routine, and we are all very, very busy. So we don't really, or mainly, most time don't plan a quality time that we can sit and talk, not just necessarily about the trauma, but about what we have experienced, like to take a glass of wine, sit next to TV, go out. Sometimes we have young kids, sometimes we work hard. Some of the people work in shifts, long time, and then they come back, get sleep. When we are older, we have to take of our parents. So we have to ask on a regular basis in every family of us, how often do we talk with each other, really talk with each other, and don't just send WhatsApp, SMS, or just solve problems and share, now you have to take this, you have to do this. So making awareness that we have to keep time for couples, quality time. Maybe it's in the morning, maybe it's in the days after the shift. I know it's not that easy, but taking the awareness and building and trying to find a short time that you can talk and have and to increase the intimacy. We know that if you talk and you have the quiet time of talking and either sharing emotion or solving problems during these times, it helps to improve intimacy. And then that's my idea, have a plan for talking. That's what we are trying to do when we have our couples cleaning that is based on the help you would suggest later on and the same protocol. Tell the couples you have to find some time for your couplehood, planning and sharing time together. So I hope it answers your question.
Thanks. I think it probably feels daunting to a lot of people with all of the complications of shift work and children, parents, jobs, whatever people's demands might be on their time. But when we have, jobs where there are going to be traumatic exposures, then, having this plan so that you're talking about the trauma before someone, or not while someone is actively reactive to the trauma. So, I think that's one of the things we have to be careful about, how much we put families in the role of trauma therapist, as we mentioned earlier with Tim's points.
Can I say,
so-
Heidi, I've heard
Yes,
back from
please.
the person who had asked the question. I think it's a good
Yep.
question. So if
Okay.
you're okay, I can address it. The person said, yes, please. So the question was about Indigenous people and just surviving residential school, and just people who've survived residential school and day schools would be PSP providers as well. And how does that impact not being able to complete your limbic system? So the one thing I would say about this from a national perspective, why I'm so passionate about understanding social responses, is that how collectively the nation has responded to residential schools impacts whether or not people can recover from trauma. Because when the negative social responses come at a national level, or the lack of response comes, that really does affect people's ability to heal, because society is responding in a certain way. So for someone who may have survived, say, residential or day school and was traumatized as a result of having been there, and then they go into a profession like this, the clinical term people use is like complex trauma, where being traumatized in your childhood and being exposed to those things and all those negative responses in childhood, and then going into a trauma exposed profession, there may be years of not finishing traumatic responses. And so it gets even harder and harder to kind of deal with that. On the flip side, people really do find a way to survive those things, and they really do find a way in some ways to thrive despite those hard things. So I try not to make too many assumptions, which I say, like, talk to people about how do they deal with it. They oftentimes have found some really incredible ways to adapt and change and those kinds of things. But for anybody who's had long-standing childhood trauma and then they go into a trauma-exposed profession, I would just say it's not a guarantee, but the risk of negative things coming of that goes up. Just because if you've got it in your background and it's unresolved, and then you put more trauma on top of it, it makes it harder to deal with the stuff that's coming in. At the same time, some people who've seen a lot of stuff aren't maybe as affected by people who maybe have never seen anything, and the first time they see a dead body, they just completely can't even cope with it. So again, I try not to paint everything too broad strokes, but I did want to address that part, because particularly the social response piece for me, just in our country, is really important to understand why that's so important. It's what I call it Canada's primary trauma that we're still trying to get through, and how we respond really matters.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tim. So when we think back to this idea that spouses might be placed in a position to kind of monitor and adapt and walk on eggshells and try to accommodate for levels of distress, and how that can have short-term benefits, but maybe contribute to some long-term patterns that don't serve the person with the trauma or the spouse. You can see how the spouse might develop their own issues, their own impacts on their mental health and well-being. So Rahel, I'm wondering if you can speak to further on why it's important for the spouse to have access to services in their own right, independent of being a support system to the public safety personnel.
Yeah, I think this is the first step. I mean, the first step should be like the awareness, the understanding, the language of understanding what's going on, and understanding this is not only me. There is a situation and I might need help to myself, to my couplehood, and to all the family. So I think spouse that feels overwhelmed or in ways of distress can get different levels of help. She should take care of her mental and physical health, because what we see, it's sometimes the spouses take so much burden and stuff over on their shoulders that they don't necessarily have time to take care of their own physical health and mental health. So there are different levels of help that could be reached both in Israel and in Canada. So it could be like something that is taken care of like a group for spouses. It could be a psychoeducation, some knowledge that you can get and read and find in the internet. It could be some, even it doesn't have to be necessarily treatment or intervention. It could be something that each spouse could do for herself as a way to maintain her mental and physical health. Later on, if it's not enough, everyone can go to individual therapy to help her to overcome with these challenges. And if needed, and there are, again, as someone wrote in the chat, couples intervention, different types. And in these areas, we are trying as a couple to help both couples to cope with it. None of them, as Tim said, is having or taking the responsibility of the PTSD or the personality issue. We have something that we want to fight together, and together as a united team, we can easily or in a better way kind of fight this PTSD. So I think, as Tim said, it's also related to this social support, what the society thinks about going to therapy, asking for help. But this is a change that should be done, that people don't have to stay in isolation, feel loneliness, feel that they don't know what's going on, and try to make connected, find other people, meet other people via Zoom or via such opportunity, and try to get help at the right timing and right level for them through the way. And there are many, many options.
Thanks so much. And so we're going to take you through the next slide. So Lisa's going to let you know about some of the next steps and some of we've put the resources in the chat there. Some of them are downstream when people really need the intervention. And the one that we want to highlight is PSP Families Wellbeing Hub, which is in development, which will have a couples toolkit. So Lisa, over to you.
I see that Emily did post those in the chat, so I'll move forward to what we're doing next. As far as our Family Matters research group, we've organized several future events, and we invite you to join us on September 22nd for an event focused on families and PSP organizations, as well as on December 1st, when we will introduce PSPNet Families Wellbeing Hub. And the Families Wellbeing Hub is in development. So it is on the existing PSPNet platform, and it's designed to provide a continuum of evidence-based and trauma-informed mental health resources and supports, including family resources, a couples toolkit, and a spouse or significant other wellbeing course. We also will post the slides after the presentation, so you can go to those to find out. Those links will be active and connect back with those resources. On behalf of everyone here today, I extend our sincere appreciation to Tim and Rahel for joining us to share their extensive knowledge and experiences on this very important topic. We thank you both for the work you're doing to support PSP families. Many thanks to Emily at SIPCERT for keeping us organized and supporting registration and hosting, and the Families Matter Research Group for their ongoing input and guidance. And a special thank you to all of you for joining us today. Turn it over to Heidi for our final thoughts.
Before we leave, we really want to be able to acknowledge the support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, or SSHRC. We have a partnership development grant called Families Matter, a partnership of partners to study, serve, and support the families of military, veteran, public safety personnel. So we partner with SIPCERT, with SIMVR, and the Vanier Institute of the Family And we'd also like to thank Medavie Foundation for their investment in Lisa's position, which is designed to create the PSP Families Network. Coming from the military space, as many of us have for research and program development, we know that the same kind of network and connectivity is not there for first responder families, for public safety families. And as a family member myself in a PSP family, it's so important that we continue to connect and raise the profile and understanding of what it means to be on the job and how those occupational risks and requirements shape our day-to-day life, and to provide us with the tools that we're doing. So we encourage you to check out the website for Families Matter Research Group, where we have information on all the current projects that we're doing. We are a large group of researchers doing a variety of different programs, projects, and there's lots of things that are active, and we welcome questions. So a final word from Tim, a final word from Rahel before we close off. Tim.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's such a short time since we started. I would just say that, you know, if you feel like you don't know what's going on, you're not alone. And a lot of us are really, like, we're only at the start of what we're starting to understand this stuff. So it's not you. Just because you haven't been able to figure this stuff out. I mean, I'm a trauma therapist, and it's very hard to do when my intentional job is to try and help people recover from trauma. So please give yourself a break and don't put too much on yourself to sort this stuff out. The field is just starting to figure this stuff out, and that's why we're trying to share this with you. So please go gentle with yourselves, and please understand that organizations are trying to catch up to understand this stuff. And once they do, things will get better, but just stay connected to each other. And I think, to emphasize what Rahel had said, this is something that you and your spouse, if you join together to combat trauma, that's your best chance. If you try to do it individually in separate corners of the house, it really makes it a lot harder. So to the extent that you can join together as a team to do it, it will certainly stand you in good stead. So I just wish you all the best with your families, and thank you for inviting me. It's lovely to be here with all of you, and turn it over to Rahel.
Just to say thank you for inviting me, and understanding that at the end we are more similar than different. So despite I'm coming from a different country, different weather, different culture, most of the things that have been talked here, we and Tim are agree, and we have shared, and we developed some of it together. And I really has the right and the privilege to try and help people, and we can do it. We can try and help people as we do it. So if you need help, if you have some more questions to me or to other people, please don't hesitate and write email or question, or I can write my email like here. I think it wasn't in the chat. And wish you all the best. And thank you for this unique opportunity to reach the community.
Thanks, everyone, and please fill out your survey so we can see how we did today, how well this met your needs, and you know, some of the information that we need to develop for you next. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.